It is a pity indeed, but the good news is we are joined, as we could not be last week, with my next guest, Laurie Spencer, who is an independent journalist, author, and radio personality. We couldn't meet her last week because, well, she was in Oklahoma in the midst of a storm that knocked out all the power, but here, large as life, she joins us on the mother of all talk shows. Laurie, good to see you looking fabulous. We'll come to more contemporary issues in a minute, but you and I have many things in common, and one of them is a great love for Jack Kennedy and a great determination to get to the truth about who killed Jack Kennedy, because well, we all have different reasons for loving him. Mine are oft repeated. I won't repeat them again now. But one thing I think can be broadly agreed is that everything started to go downhill after the nightmare on Elm Street and the murder of the American president, John F. Kennedy. So you're a
That's right.
real researcher, a serious student of what happened there. Are we supposed to just shrug and accept the now overwhelming likelihood that the American state itself murdered their own president? Does nobody think that's worth anything at all? I mean, that's how it feels to me. I mean,
Me too.
Tucker Carlson explicitly accused them on Fox News, and everybody just kind of shrugged, not least the president's own party, the so-called Democrats. Where do you stand on all that?
What's really astonishing, George, is that after Tucker did that segment, we got no comment at all from the CIA. His show reached out to Mike Pompeo. He reached out to the current CIA director for comment. Nothing. And they're still playing games with the files. You know, the JFK Records Act was passed by Congress overwhelmingly back in 1992. And that was because of Oliver Stone's picture, JFK, that caused such tremendous outrage that the government was still withholding files. And that was 30 years after the fact. Here we are 60 years after the fact. Those files were supposed to be declassified in full no later than October 26th, 2017, back when Trump was president. Under the law, the president, and solely the president, has the power to declassify and release the files. Okay? So we've had two presidents now who've kicked this can further and further down the road. And here's what troubles me most, George, is that it's the president's job. The CIA shouldn't have a say in this. The FBI shouldn't have a say in this. It was the will of Congress and the will of the people that the president alone would have the power to declassify those documents. And instead, both presidents have caved to the intelligence community. Every time a deadline comes up for those files to be released, the president gets a visit from the CIA director, from the director of the FBI, and they say, well, we've got sources and methods, and we're just not ready to release those yet. And the president just takes orders from them. He says, oh, okay, so I'll push that down the road. It's astonishing.
Maybe the files are in a cardboard box behind a pretty little green Corvette in Wilmington, Delaware. That is, of course, a possibility. But the fact that they have not released these files is, I mean, it tells you everything, doesn't it? What do you think they've got to hide in those files?
You know what they say, George? Sometimes no comment is more incriminating than a comment. The fact that they're saying nothing should tell us everything we need to know.
And what conclusion do we, I mean, Jack Kennedy was overwhelmingly likely to be re-elected for a second term as President of the United States. How different
That's
things
right.
might have been if he had been. He might even have been succeeded by his brother Robert Kennedy, but they killed them both.
That's
And
right.
this seems to me to be a turning point in American history. Before this happened in Dealey Plaza, you could credibly say that much of the world wanted to be an American, as the song in West Side Story said. But after it, America became the ugly America that we know today, didn't it?
Exactly. And unfortunately, President Kennedy's successor, his chosen vice president, Lyndon Johnson, whom he had tremendous respect for, and vice versa, unfortunately, he reversed Kennedy's plans to go into Vietnam. You know, in October of 1963, President Kennedy made it very clear that he wanted to pull all U.S. personnel out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. He signed National Security Action Memorandum 263 and brought home the first 1,000 troops before Christmas. Unfortunately, Johnson immediately reversed that and within a year committed ground forces and air to the Vietnam War. And we all know what happened after that. Another thing that Kennedy planned to do in his second term, which I don't think many people are aware of, you know, Fidel Castro had gone to the Soviet Union in 1963. He made a much ballyhooed trip over there. And President Kennedy saw this. And I think, you know, he was already doing some back channel negotiations with Castro, trying to find a rapprochement with the Cuban situation. But President Kennedy was most likely planning his own trip to the Soviet Union in his second term, which would have been absolutely historic. The Cold War was starting to warm up in the final months of his presidency. He and Nikita Khrushchev were actually having a pretty good dialogue back and forth. I would almost go so far as to say that they were becoming friends. Khrushchev cried when President Kennedy died, you know? So had President Kennedy made that trip to Moscow, imagine how different the next 60 years could have been.
Yeah, we would have never have lived through Russiagate as we've been doing all these years. Just before we leave film, you mentioned Oliver Stone's immaculate work, JFK, and subsequent work. We've got the Oscars coming up. Can we expect a visit by Zelensky to the Oscars, do you think? What'll be the highlights?
I just can't wait for all that virtue signaling from the Hollywood elite about how much they love and support Ukraine. My God, George, did you hear the news today? I mean, Germany, Nazi Germany, just declared war on Russia. What year is it? Where are we? Is
what
it
could possibly go
1941?
wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? And yet over here in the United States, it's not our top story today. You'd think every newspaper would have the headline World War III begins. Germany declares war on Russia. And people over here in the US are just going about their day. It doesn't even register with them that World War III is underway. It's not something that's coming. It's not something that we're trying to prevent. It's too late. It's already begun. Are they waiting for a formal declaration of war?
Extraordinary. Of course, it is historically the case that the American people think that they are safe with oceans apart, oceans away from the theater of battle. And of course, that has hitherto been true. But Of
Not
course,
always, though. We
American
haven't
lives
forgotten
were
December
lost
7th,
in these
1941.
wars. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say that's not always the case. We still remember December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. That was when you know, that was when our illusions of not being touched by the World War were shattered. We haven't forgotten that.
Yes,
I
of
hope
course
we
that's
haven't.
true. Although Hawaii is a moot point and a long way from the United States
The mainland.
itself. But
Right.
yeah, yeah, you'll see I'm not all that keen on how the United States annexed Hawaii, but leave that for another day. The reality is, if the war starts, it will be your sons and daughters nowadays that will be fighting it because, as I keep saying, I'm not sure it's fully understood in the United States. Portugal isn't going to fight Russia. Neither is Spain or Greece or the Netherlands or Belgium. It'll be thee and me. It'll be the United States and the United Kingdom. They will be the only people who are actually fighting Russia in World War III. So the US will not be clear of the carnage. And of course, if it becomes, as seems to me inevitable, a nuclear confrontation, then nobody in the world will be clear of that carnage. Indeed, we'll all be going into that good night. But that just doesn't seem to be grasped in the United
It's
States.
just like, yeah, it's just like President Kennedy said about his generals in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis when they wanted to use nuclear weapons. He said to some of his close advisors, he said, no one's going to be around to tell them they were wrong. And George, we're already involved. We've lost 6 Americans that I know of in this current conflict. Just lost another former Navy man a few days ago, last week. And as we speak, there are Ukrainian troops here on American soil, right here in Oklahoma, training at Fort Sill.
I was going to say, they're in your very state.
They're in my state. And nobody told us they were coming until they were already here. Nobody asked the citizenry of Oklahoma if we wanted this, if this was safe or okay. So they're over here training on Patriot missile systems as we speak, George. And to my mind, that means our armed forces are involved, whether that's in a advisory capacity or a battlefield capacity. We are involved. And I would think that Putin probably looks at it the same way. As well he should.
I would think so too. And of course, advisors were what the first Americans in Vietnam were called. And advisors, as history shows us, are constantly reinforced with more and more lethal aid and then boots on the ground. But those boots will not be uncontested. I was making the point earlier, with all due respect to Afghans and Iraqis, Russia is not the Taliban. Russia is not Saddam Hussein's broken-backed regime in 2003. Russia is more than capable of fighting back.
That's right. That's right. You know, the Taliban didn't have nuclear
Laurie,
weapons.
I love your work, and now that we've met, I love you. How can people follow you? How can they support you?
You can find me on YouTube at Laurie Spencer, and you can find me on Twitter at Real Laurie Spencer. And I love you, George. I've loved you for 25 years. And as a matter of fact, to get myself psyched up for this interview, I was rewatching last night, and I've watched it many times. I watched your testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee back in, what was that, 2005?
Yeah,
it was
a good day.
Beautiful.
Just beautiful. God gave me wings that day. It's my best day so far, Laurie. But this one, meeting you on the mother of all talk shows, is up there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I encourage everyone to follow Laurie on Twitter and to look at her work on YouTube. It really is of the highest caliber.